Hello and welcome to the um, Queen of Peace Book Club, our first ever Queen of Peace Book Club regarding St. Cyril of Alexandria on the unity of Christ. And I'm a little bit early, so I'm going to give people a chance to kind of flock in. Um, those of you who are members have received a link so that you can participate and even join in the live video so that you can discuss with us. And all of our employees and owners have that as well. So if you wish to participate live and fully participate on video and everything, just as you would in person, all members are going to be able to do that. Those of you who aren't members, you can participate in the chat. You can participate any way like that, but I can't give you the link because the book club itself is member only. And then the last thing I'll say on that, but feel free to participate and send questions, comments, concerns, whatever, via the chat. And also feel free to send questions to me by the phone. Oh, we do have somebody joining already. So, hello, Byron.
Hi.
All right, awesome. So I'm glad you were able to join. Glad that you got the link and everything. Um, so we're still just a little bit early, and I was just saying that if you want to participate, feel free to speak up, interject, um, whatever you need to do, so that um, to participate.
Awesome. Thanks. Appreciate that.
Right. And we'll see if we get some more folks again. If you do have questions and you're not one of the members who will have the link, then so you're just watching the live stream, then go ahead and use the chat feature on the side or use the comment feature so that we can see what you're saying, and I will do my best to address any comments and any questions. And this first episode will also be available on YouTube, or I shouldn't say episode. This first session, this first book club session, will be available on YouTube as well. But after this introduction session, the rest of them are going to be member only. So you'll have to actually be a member like Byron and do it that way. So Byron, how are you doing?
I've been doing good. Thank you for asking. This
Cool.
is my first book club, so
Oh,
don't
awesome.
on me.
Yeah, well, it's a pretty easy book to get started with, to be honest. It's not super long, so I'm really excited. So how did you get interested in the book club?
Because I'm studying mysticism,
Okay, awesome.
and uh, I believe in the Holy Spirit. We all have a connection with the Spirit. Just at different times, it's not as strong as other times. And I know this book club talks about a lot of religious stuff in the spirit, so
Right.
that's why I decided to join.
Awesome. All right. Well, I look forward to kind of hearing your input and questions and different things, and I
Yeah,
think that's awesome.
thanks.
So have you ever read any books like this before?
No, this is the first of its kind where it's just it's almost like a conversation of sorts. But it's almost like taking one idea and looking at the flip side of each thought is kind of what the format reads to me. I don't know. Is that your take on it?
Yeah, so that is so the goal that Cyril kind of has in mind here is to write kind of a philosophical dialogue. So very similar in style to kind of how like Socrates gets represented, we might say. Because Socrates never actually wrote anything. In fact, he was against writing. It was his student Plato who wrote down what Socrates taught.
Mhm.
And so that sort of conversational style of writing is basically how a lot of the philosophers communicate, and Cyril is operating in that tradition, because Alexandria was actually a super big hub of philosophy back in the day.
Do we know which Alexandria this particular Cyril was talking about? Is it the one in uh, Egypt or?
Yes, it would be
Okay,
Alexandria, Egypt.
okay.
He was actually he was a very high-ranking church leader called an archbishop, and he was the archbishop of, or they might have been calling them metropolitans already. I'm not totally sure on that. I think that the term metropolitan was in use, so he would have been the metropolitan of Alexandria in Egypt. And back then, Alexandria, Egypt was one of the biggest cities in the Roman Empire. So kind of a big deal, that guy.
Yeah, yeah. In Alexandria, it was basically like the center stone of all the knowledge and artifacts and everything, right?
That's right. That's right. The Library of Alexandria was actually, up until that point, the largest library ever compiled. Unfortunately, it got burned, so we don't have access to any of that now, but
Hmm.
um, people will be people, right?
That's that's unfortunate, but yeah, that's also true. Um, the the way that the book reads, it kind of alludes to maybe like a devil versus the spirit kind of format as well. Like it's almost like it's questioning if there's like an antichrist in the way that it reads. I don't know what your take is on that.
Right. No, there definitely is that element too, because Cyril basically writes this book in response to another church leader,
Mhm.
who would actually be condemned by the church.
Mm.
His name was Nestorius, and basically Nestorius got this idea that we should not describe the Virgin Mary as the Mother of God, and his basic argument is something like, well, you shouldn't describe Mary as the Mother of God because a human woman couldn't give birth to God, because God is the origin of all life. So it doesn't make sense in that sense. So she's the mother of Christ. Well, that leaves Cyril scratching his head, and he says, well, if the Virgin Mary is the mother of Christ but not the mother of God, then that means that Christ is somebody other than God. So
Hmm.
what's going on there? So Cyril basically, he takes that and writes this whole book to kind of philosophically work through this problem with what Nestorius is saying.
Hmm.
And ultimately the church ends up siding with Cyril and says, yeah, Cyril was correct and Nestorius was incorrect. And that's actually called the Council of Calcedon, where the church came together, and bishops from all over the world came together and discussed this. And that's actually where we know a lot about the importance of Cyril, because essentially at the council, Cyril becomes sort of the test of what it means to be what's called orthodox, which means right believing. So Cyril is actually the one. They're there Nowadays we oftentimes think of people kind of sitting around maybe debating about a verse from the Bible. Well, at that time, they were actually sitting around with like Cyril's writings saying, well, that's not consistent with this, and that's So it's kind of an interesting take. Um, and I don't know if you read the introduction portion of this book too, but it talks about the fact that the later on in history, when there the councils were meeting and discussing various issues, there was another controversy called the Monophysite Controversy. And the Monophysites were basically another group who, in if you think of Nestorius as saying that Jesus isn't fully God, the Monophysites kind of went the opposite direction and said Jesus wasn't fully man. He was just God and not fully human. So they were really into Cyril, but later church councils kind of scolded the Monophysites a little bit and said, "Well, you say that you're really into Cyril, but you're not taking Cyril seriously enough, because if you were, you would know that Jesus is fully God and fully man." So it is really interesting when you kind of get into
Yeah.
this stuff. It's like so often what ends up happening is really just people trying too hard to explain away the mysterious elements of the faith, really. I
Right.
mean, that's even, that's
Smart.
even kind of what Islam is, really. Islam, people don't realize it, but when you read the Quran, the the problem with the Quran is not that it's like um anti-Christian. The problem with the Quran is actually that it tries to be Christian without mystery. God doesn't have a son because if God has a son, that's too complicated, so we're just going to write the son out of it and
Right.
say that God doesn't have a son. Well, you know, that's you can go that way, but that's not that's not what the church has taught.
Right.
So definitely. So, but from the perspective of your interest in mysticism, I think that what you'll really latch on to in Cyril is actually the idea of the incarnation and how that relates to our salvation. So, from Cyril's perspective and from the perspective of what today is called orthodoxy, um, what Jesus actually accomplishes is that because he's both fully God and fully man, and because of this mysterious incarnation, which we totally admit is mysterious, right? Like I understand why Islam doesn't want to touch that and why Islam wants to reject that, because it is really difficult to wrap your mind around.
Spooky action.
Um exactly. So, but because of that mystery, we actually experience something called theosis, which basically translates to English as divinization.
Mm.
So, because God has become man, man can actually ascend to experience union with God. And I think that's the point where Cyril is going to really appeal to you in that mystical mindset, is like when he starts getting on about this, and other fathers do it even more, like Gregory of Nazianzus and some of the books that I remember you actually bought from the bookstore.
Yep.
Some of those talk even more about this concept, but it's like because God has come down to us, that
Hmm.
means that he can bring us up to him. And so I think that's going to be where your mystical bent is going to really light a fire with this stuff, because you're going to be reading that and that's going to click for you. A lot of the technical stuff is important because it sets that up, but I
Hmm.
think that's going to be the part that really appeals to you, where you're going to be like, "Oh, this is what I like. This is what I want to read about." That's going to really um yeah, really come alive and be on fire with that.
Oh, good. Yeah, because that's where it's at for me. Like that's the minutia of the Holy Spirit, in my opinion.
Right. Exactly. It's like that practical piece I think is more important in, like, all of the doctrinal things are great,
Mhm.
but they are important to set up that practical piece of actually coming into right relationship with God.
Yeah.
If if you don't have that, then you can study all the books in the world and know all the facts in the world, but
Mm.
it's not worth anything if you don't actually have the relationship piece with
Yeah.
God.
Yeah, that connection. They're just little breadcrumbs, right? They're just little
Right.
talking data points, and until you could add them together, it really, and the even the Bible itself, or the what is this book called,
The unity of
the
Christ.
Unity of Christ. Like even this book there, it's a deconstruction
Right.
of what already is. And so our task then is, if we don't know what already is, to kind of reverse engineer what we've already reverse engineered.
Right.
Go back, to the source, so to speak.
Right, exactly. It's like in the ancient world, they used to talk a lot about the fountainhead, where you want to go to the fountainhead. It's great if you can be at the bottom of the waterfall collecting the water, but where you really want to be is at the top of the waterfall, because that's where you're getting it at the source. Like if
Yeah,
you're at the bottom, then you're sort of reliant on
can be contaminated
on-
a little bit,
right,
yeah,
exactly.
or not as pure, or you might not get as much.
Right, exactly. And that's why in the East we talk a lot the about partaking of the divine nature and seeing the uncreated light, which we don't necessarily mean. I mean, seeing with our eyes as part of that, because we're not purely spiritual beings. You know, we have a physical nature, so we do often experience that as seeing with our eyes.
Hmm.
But seeing the uncreated light is more about encountering God as He is and experiencing God for who He is, not just not just a set of ideas, but who God actually is. And so that's something that's very important to our mindset, and it's something that we believe everyone can experience as well. It's not just something for monks in a mountain somewhere to experience. Those monks are important, but
Oh, I love that.
it's not just for them.
They're the best. Like, as far as I mean, at least from what I've, in my own experience,
Right,
because they get in tune, right? And I think that's what we all seek when we go to church, when we read the Bible, or pray, is we're trying to get in tune with
right,
spirit, with our being. And they just have it down because they practice it day in and day out. Where we kind of, we'll squeeze it in somewhere if we can.
right, right. No, it's very true. We get sort of, it's like Jesus talked about how one of the ways people would miss out on the kingdom was not that they were like these horrible people, oh, they're such terrible sinners. What he said was actually that they just got too busy. They got choked out by the cares of this age, and he describes them as like seeds that fall among thorn bushes. It's like, yeah, it sprouts up a little bit, but then the thorn bush chokes it out, and it dies. And that's ultimately what so many people in this modern world have happened to them.
That is exactly what's happening. It's
Exactly.
it's like the Christmas tree, you know.
Right.
It's like getting it cut off. That's a representation of the tree. It's life cut off at the stump.
Right.
Only through the miracle can that stump sprout a new leaf. You
Exactly.
know? And I see
Exactly.
that every day. But we're persevering. We're on
That's right.
the
That's right.
we're still alive.
Exactly. Exactly. We're still alive. We're still going strong. Still, we're here doing what
Yep.
we need to be doing. So
Spreading the
this
word.
is good. This is good.
Nice. Is it
So,
us in here so?
yeah. What's that?
Is it just the two of us in here so far, or are there more?
There are some other people joining on the live stream, but they haven't put anything in the chat yet. So we'll see if they come up with some good questions for us. But I'm gonna go ahead and kind of get us started, and we'll see if anybody else joins in. Because there were a couple other people who were gonna join, but I know one of them had another commitment, and then I think next week I think we'll have more people because there supposed to be some more people who signed up.
Oh, cool.
But this week it was kind of weird because um, I'm a little under the weather, so I didn't want to do the in-person section just because with the way things are these days, and I don't know what your thoughts are on COVID, but just with the way things are, I just don't want to take any chances that I would get somebody sick and
Yeah. There's a lot to contend with.
right. Exactly.
You don't want to rock the boat. You don't want to get anybody sick. You know, you're doing the
Right.
right stuff. You're doing the right steps.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's like the other day my priest he said, I don't necessarily think we should live in fear of a virus, but I also don't want to do anything to actively help spread a virus either. So it's kind of this balance.
Which we could save a whole conversation about this virus and all that kind of other stuff um, for the sidelines, me and you, one of these days, because I have a whole opinion on that. Let me tell you.
Oh, good. I'd love to have that conversation.
Yeah.
Um cuz I definitely have some opinions as well. Probably not ones I should share on a public forum, but yeah.
Yeah.
um
Yeah. Exactly. Trying to find my charger. Sorry, I'm not. I'm listening to you, but
no problem.
trying to find
No
my phone.
problem. You are good to go. I actually interviewed somebody on my YouTube show a couple weeks ago and he was doing that too, and
Oh,
so I don't mind at all.
yeah. Sorry if I'm making you dizzy. Just turn away. I don't know what I did.
uh, So I'm kind of going to confuse everybody a little bit because this first session is going to be called Introduction. And then next week we'll actually start to delve into the introduction of the book. But the reason I wanted to do that is because the introduction of the book has some good history of kind of who Cyril was and what he was dealing with in his own time that I think will be good for everybody to see. But I wanted to give us an idea of a couple things. Um, and I will talk a little bit tonight about who Cyril is, and we can discuss that a little bit and kind of what was going on. But I also want to kind of just discuss a little bit about why it's a good idea to read a book like this. We talked a little bit about it before with the mysticism, but even just in general, not everybody is necessarily as interested in mysticism, not everybody is interested in history, and so the question could come up like, why should I read a book by somebody who's been dead for many, many centuries? What does that have to do with my life? And it's easy to kind of push a question like that off and say, you know, you're not going to read one of the wisest people who ever lived because they were dead, because of the year they were born and died. Like that's, but I think what makes it a valid question is, especially today, we tend to think that it's impossible that these people had the same sort of struggles and experiences that I have. But there's nothing new under the sun. And oftentimes, the questions we're wrestling with are just variations of the same questions that people have always been wrestling with. And it's really interesting to examine what their thoughts are. And C.S. Lewis, someone much closer to our time than Cyril of Alexandria, said, in his own day that it was that the wise man was one who would read at least one old book for every new book that he tries to read. And the reason for that is kind of interesting in C.S. Lewis's mind. The reason for that is a couple things. One is people back then weren't necessarily smarter than people today, but they tended to get things right that we get wrong and get things wrong that we get right. So, you know, given the fact that I live in this time, no matter how much I may think that I'm outside of it, no matter how much I may think that I've outsmarted the age in which I live, the truth is that I imbibe a lot of things, a lot of tendencies, a lot of preferences, and a lot of mindsets that I've just sort of inherited from the world around me. And that doesn't make me a bad person, but it does mean that the only way that I can be challenged in that is to read these old books that are coming from a very different perspective. So that's one really awesome thing about reading old books. And another thing is that the old books tend to, these are things that have been proven over time by the experience and by use through many, many generations. So a book like Cyril's book, thousands upon thousands of people have read this book and benefited from it. And that's true in ways that modern books just can't really compete with. Even really good modern books that are maybe rightly so on the top of bestseller lists for long periods of time today, they still don't really compete with the fact that, maybe they've helped many people today, but a book like this has helped many people over many centuries, and there's definitely something to be said for that. So the two things there are, we read old books because they're proven, and we read old books because they challenge us in a unique way. So Byron, what do you think about that kind of mindset? Does that get you excited about reading some old books?
Oh yeah, definitely.
I mean, I know because you're into mysticism, so you're probably reading old books all the time,
uh,
but
well, not well, yes and no. But yeah, mysticism is definitely based off of more of a Socratic way of thinking. It's it's more intuitive, right? It's more about your relationship with the world and with the spirits around you.
Mhm.
But to answer specifically more your question about if it gets me excited, yeah, it gets me really excited because um, we're in a world of science,
Right.
and the world of science wants certainty,
Mm.
and spirituality can't provide that. And that's why the philosophers, if you've ever read any philosophy, like the story of Eros or any of that,
Mhm.
um, you can understand that there's parts of life that just aren't certain. You just
Right.
can't pin it down. It's like slapping the hedgehogs if you try to. And so
Right.
that's why I like to read some of these older books. It's a refreshing.
It is. It is. Yeah, I love that too, it's like we tend to have this mindset that if I can't know something with this sort of mathematical certainty on the level at which I know that 2 plus 2 is 4, then it must not be true. But there's different ways of knowing things, and our forefathers understood that our intellect was a valid way of coming to conclusions. And that's why when you read, Thomas Aquinas and he's talking about proof of the existence of God, when he talks about proof, he doesn't mean that he did a science experiment and I came to the conclusion that God exists. Like that's just an absurd way of thinking about spiritual realities, as if we could. It's kind of arrogant in a way, you know. It's like we think that we have this mastery over the earth and that we could exhaustively know everything, and it's just like, no, you can't. um
You could feel your way through everything, but you can't
right.
know your way through everything.
Right. And
Uh,
even nowadays there's been a lot of, not to be too down on science, cuz science is important too, but I I did just recently read an article, and it was talking about how there's been this huge problem in the practical sciences because they're having a, what they're calling a repeatability crisis. And that crisis is that basically the whole point of the scientific method is that if you repeat these steps, you should essentially always come to the same result. But what they're finding is that it doesn't always work out that way. So, as well as it's been sort of advertised in the scientific community, and that's been causing a little bit of an epistemic crisis for a lot of people who have really put their trust in this sort of physical interpretation of the world, and they're kind of scratching their heads saying, well, where do we go from here? Because that, from in their interpretation, they're saying like, well, science has failed us because it's not producing the kind of knowledge that we thought it could. From from kind of your and my perspective, it's like, well, I don't know that that's a failure, because what you discerned before was that when you followed these steps, this result happened. Now you're finding that when you follow those steps, sometimes a different result happens. And maybe that's okay too. Like,
yeah, it's also a little bit of taking the small part and trying to use the smaller part, or the lesser knowledge, I guess, and using that lesser knowledge to explain a higher knowledge, right?
right.
Because we don't know everything about the universe.
Exactly.
So if we don't know everything, then we can't say that we know God based off of science. The only
Right.
way to do it is to, I mean, my personal opinion is to feel your way through it, is to just know it and to build that relationship. It's like trying to get to know it's like me trying to get know Kevin. Well, I
Right.
know Kevin, I know of Kevin, but I don't know Kevin. Like I don't know like what you're thinking all the time. I don't know what
Right.
only you do.
That's right. Yeah, it's like, when, that's a great point. It's like, no, trying to prove God scientifically is kind of a nonsensical task, because if you think of God as a personal being, then you don't know someone by doing, like, even my wife, I don't know her by doing experiments to discern whatever. I and I don't know her perfectly. I learn things about her every day, but I know her by a process of engaging with her and communicating with her and growing in relationship, not by some process of mathematical whatever.
You're not dissecting
Um,
her, you're communicating with her, you're talking with her, you're building a connection. You're not
exactly.
deconstructing her.
Right, because that would be bad.
And ultimately would probably kill her in the end if you truly like wanted to dissect her wholly.
Right.
Oh, it would be very bad
Right.
for your wife.
It would. It would be very bad for him, very bad for me as well.
Yeah.
I would not know her any better than I did before, and I would cease my examinations.
Exactly.
Um, so now, I guess the question then is, can we get to know Cyril in a way? Can we get to know Saint Cyril in a way that would help us to understand his work a little bit? And we can't get to know Cyril necessarily as well. I mean, to a certain extent, we can know Cyril in the way that, um, I, as a Christian, have cultivated a relationship with my patron saint, and this is one of those things where I think that people who really don't believe in mysticism, don't believe in a mystical universe. I think that they hear what I say on this and they just kind of think I'm insane a little bit, because I truly believe that I cultivate a relationship with the last Tsar of Russia, my patron saint, Tsar Nicholas. I truly believe that he and I are friends, and I talk to him every day. And I have talked to people like atheists and stuff who just think that sounds totally insane, but
And
but
it's not.
that's it's well, it's not. And so I believe we can get to know Cyril that way, but that takes time and effort and these things. But we can know a little bit about Cyril and his life. So Cyril was what was called a patriarch in Alexandria. We were talking about that earlier. And if you're so inclined, the time period that he was what was called a patriarch was from 412 to 444 AD. And he was actually, one thing that makes him so interesting is he actually held this position of authority during the time when Alexandria was going through somewhat of a golden age of philosophy and learning. And in a lot of ways, the Christian church at that time was actually very reliant on the Church of Alexandria. A lot of Americans today don't really understand how much Christianity is actually. They don't understand how much Christianity is an ancient religion, but they don't understand how much Christianity has, and all of how Christian thought has played out and how Christians have practiced. They don't understand how much Christianity is an Eastern religion and is a religion that is the thought of which developed in not the Western world, developed in Egypt and um, Africa and other parts of Africa, um, developed in the Middle East mostly. I mean, that's where Israel is. That's where Jesus lived. So, like, it seems just intuitive that this would be the case, but in a lot of segments of American Christianity, this is just revolutionary. So I do like to point this out, that when Saint Cyril was active in his ministry, Alexandria was actually kind of the hub of intellectual activity. Most of what we would call major universities were in Alexandria. They looked a lot different than what we would call universities because they tended to be more Socratic and philosophical, but they were the equivalent of universities. And that they were in Alexandria, most of them. And most of your really solid, really deep theology was coming out of Alexandria at this time as well. A lot of the stuff that was coming out of other parts of the world was not so solid and not so deep and had some unfortunate ramifications, but that's all a topic for another day. Um, Now, Roman Catholics are usually familiar with a particular quote about Cyril, which was a quote from the Council of Calcedon. And basically, the history there is that the Pope of Rome, Pope Leo, sent delegates to the council, and those delegates read a scroll that he had written. And um, Roman Catholics love this quote, but the Eastern bishops said Peter has spoken through Leo and is in agreement with Cyril. And when that gets quoted, it's often just quoted as Peter has spoken through Leo. But what people miss in there is and is in agreement with Cyril, because what was going on at that time in the Council of Calcedon was actually that both sides of the debates going on at that time were really utilizing Saint Cyril as their argument. They were kind of, well, Cyril says this, so therefore this, and then the other person would say, that's interesting, but Cyril also says this, so wouldn't that mean this? And they were kind of going back and forth with this, but all of them, the idea was never that Cyril was in error. The idea was, how do we interpret Cyril? How do we know what Cyril is saying? And the introduction to this book even talks about that. I forget the guy who wrote the introduction. I forget what his name is. I have it somewhere. But anyway, he actually talks about this phenomenon that during this time, Cyril was so important that in some ways he was kind of a test of orthodoxy. That, like, if you agree with Cyril, you're in. If you disagree with Cyril, then, we need to talk. There's something off going on here. So, that's so I like to bring that up as well, that, as we talk about this, we are encountering and engaging with some of the most essential writings by a Christian thinker. And all of, realistically, whether you're Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Protestant, it's very likely that, unless you're in one of these like super fringe groups that really reject, you know, basic Christian teachings, um, for the most part, you probably, whether you realize it or not, are getting a lot of ideas and thoughts kind of filtered through Saint Cyril. And a lot of us probably don't even realize it, how much we are indebted to somebody like Saint Cyril. Now, a lot of modern scholars, literary scholars, probably well meaning, although some of them may not be, um, have tried to kind of malign Cyril a little bit in recent times. And he kind of falls victim to the same thing that a lot of other historical figures do, in that he's been dead for a long time and can't defend himself. So we're going to read motives into things that he said and did, and and then, he can't say that's not what I was thinking. So one of the common ones that gets thrown around involves actually the subject of this book, which is the Nestorian Controversy. So as so I the introduction to this book covers that a little bit, but basically the long and the short of it is that, when, if you happen to come across something where they're really super critical of Cyril, then you've just kind of got to ask yourself, okay, what is their source? Because if they're saying that the if they're saying that Cyril, oh well, Cyril was thinking this or Cyril was intending this, how do they know that? I mean, these are people 1700 years after Cyril. How do they know what he was thinking, and all this? So that's not really even if they have a letters behind their name, that's not a scholarly practice to sort of throw this back on somebody who can't defend themselves. So it looks like we do have a question here. So, serious question: how does one continue to follow religion? Catholic boy who went to Catholic school K through 12. I have about a dozen close friends and only one still practices. how does one remain faithful after actually reading the Bible? So that is a great question. It's a little bit outside of the topic of the Cyril thing, but I will I'll, I'll veer off course a little bit because that's a good question. So, um, Byron, do you have anything you'd like to kind of say about this person's question? I'll plaster it here so you can see it clearly.
Well, I'm a little bit miffed about remaining faithful after actually reading the Bible. I would question what is it in the reading that shook your faith. Um, but I would say that don't invest all of your faith in the Bible. I would look at other, like Cyril, for example, or other writings, and other religious leaders that have made some kind of impact maybe on your own life or someone that you could
Hmm.
connect to, and maybe start there.
Yeah, I think that's good advice, and one thing that a lot of people, y- again, well meaning, don't necessarily realize is that the Bible actually has a context as well. We're talking about kind of the historical context of where Cyril comes from, and that's really useful. I think we intuitively understand that in order to understand Cyril, I've got to understand at least a little bit about the world he comes from. But we don't apply that to the Bible. We think that 2,000 years later, can just pick up the Bible, read it, and I'm going to get exactly what, Jesus means. And I'm not bringing any of my own baggage to it, but that's absurd. Of course I'm bringing my own baggage, and I need to constantly challenge myself and go back to earlier sources. So you're spot on there. I think if you put so much stock into the Bible that you almost make the Bible into an idol, which many people do, again, I assume these are well-meaning people, but what's going to happen is, you're not going to read it rightly, and there's all kinds of stuff in the Bible that may not make sense to your average reader. It's like, why does God command, the question I get a lot is, why does God command the Israelites to kill this tribe of people? And it's like, well, if you examine the context of that, these were people who were actually descended from a race of giants, and they were, really horrible killers, and would actually, if you study extra biblical materials, you learn that, so one of these tribes, the Amalekites, used to actually kidnap little children and murder them in sacrifice to demons, basically. So yeah, when God says to wipe out these tribes, it's not because God is a big meanie, it's because God wants these horrible practices to end. Like, there's there's a context, and that context is really important to rightly understanding what's going on in the scriptures. So I would say that, but I think more, maybe more to your question, I think one thing that, you know, I guess there's two things I'll say. One is, in the modern world, a lot of people stop practicing religion because of sort of socioeconomic reasons. Like, Father Mike Schmitz talks about a young man from China who came to the United States. And when he was in China, the communist officials had actually arrested him for being in an underground Christian church, and had tortured him and done all this stuff. And none of that could break his faith. But he came to the United States, and he got a job and was climbing up the corporate ladder. And when he first came to the United States, he was so excited because he's going, man, they have church every day here. Every day I can go to a church. This is wonderful. But then as he was working more at his job, he stopped going to church as often. And within a year, this man only was going to church on Christmas and Easter. Within 2 years, he wasn't even going to church at all anymore. So he had stopped practicing his religion basically almost entirely. I mean, maybe he still prays at home or something, but he certainly was not as on fire as he was while living in China. Um, and so it was just this modern world, this modern age, this sort of secular age, this very materialist age, that is an enemy of of a spiritual life. Like, we have to address that we live lives that our forefathers would have seen as very opulent, and we tend not to want to make sacrifices for God or for our neighbors. We tend not to want to um, live in ways that challenge us. And I think that's a big part of what happens with a lot of people who end up leaving religion, is just religion makes demands on your life, and especially Christianity makes demands on your life. And if you are wanting to live this very opulent secular lifestyle that you see happening all around you, I I can only imagine that it's very easy to say, and I've even heard people say, well, I'll get right with God before I die, but right now I will just live this life and have fun. That's what I hear a lot. I'll get right with God before I die, but right now I'll have fun. It's like, well, it's not gonna it's not it's not as much fun as a real relationship with the living God. Um, Certainly not as rewarding. But I understand why people want to follow that at the same time, because it is difficult to stick with something that makes demands on you. And I guess the other thing I would say is that some Catholic schools are really good, but a lot of Catholic schools are not uniquely Catholic. So when it talks about going to Catholic school K through 12, um for a lot of people my age and a little older and a little younger, what they experienced as Catholic school was basically you went to church once a week, or maybe once a month. In a lot of Catholic schools, you go to a daily mass. You might be an altar server if you want to get out of some of your classes, but otherwise, you won't even have that experience. And you have a religion class, but that religion class is not, it never gets into anything deep. Certainly, you're not reading Cyril of Alexandria in your religion class. You're reading maybe about like the Ten Commandments or something. These sort of superficial things, these sort of superficial, I'll say superficial religious outward things, are not what define Christianity. What define Christianity is what we've been talking about, a relationship with the living God, forming that mysterious, mystical union with Christ. That's what ultimately defines the spiritual experience of a Christian. not the fact that I did certain things and learned certain prayers. Those things are good. We should want to know about, the 10 commandments and the Lord's prayer and these things. But I don't think if your whole Christianity is defined by that, um I just think that that's a very shallow it's a very shallow version of Christianity, and that's not your fault. You should have been taught better.
Mhm.
um so I'm not blaming you. I'm not saying like, oh, you were just a shallow Christian, so that you're lame, that's why you left. It's not that. It's that no one really gave you the fullness of what your birthright was, so to speak. And then it makes perfect sense to me that when you got to college and a college professor challenged you with some things maybe you weren't ready for, some objections you didn't see coming, and nobody has explained to you the beauty of the gospel. Nobody has explained to you the beauty of the faith. Nobody has really made these things. Nobody has made this truly to be a part of you. It's just something you do, but it's not a part of who you are. I can totally see why, you know, you get to a point where you're just like, man, I don't. Or so much of it too, like on the other hand, some people kind of, it's like Christianity has a lot of beautiful moral teachings, but unfortunately, some people become moralizers and kind of get this idea that, like, oh, the Bible says not to practice homosexuality, so therefore I have to, you know, I don't know, hold a sign, and that's going to somehow convince people. That's not going to convince anyone. And again, if your Christianity is sort of defined by these rules and things, well, then eventually you get to a point in life where you meet people who don't follow those rules, or maybe don't follow them very well.
Mhm.
And that might challenge you if you really like those people.
Can I add one more thing to that, Kevin?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because in that question there was a bit of a challenge, right? Because you mentioned that word just now, challenge. I think in the question is the challenge of, okay, well, I only know one person. I'm only one person, or well, two out of 13 total, right? So it's like this whole world of non-practicers and a small group of practicers in this question, in the questioner's world right here. So just be okay. To the questioner, just be okay with that. Just be okay with being a little bit different than your friends, and
Mhm.
find time for yourself. And if your friends see it as taboo, then you don't have to bring it up. You know,
Right.
who you are, as it's convenient and relevant, but you don't have to force it on them, and you don't have to allow them to force themselves onto you. If you still want to have some remnants of faith, even though you see your friends or whatever else slipping away in theirs at the moment, you could still hold on to yours, you know, and hold it in solidarity and privacy. If it's even if it's just like meditating for 50 minutes a day before you go out and hang out with your non-believer friends, that's totally fine. So that would just be another little piece, is just be okay with being that one or two unique different aspect of your relationship than the other aspects.
Yeah, I think that's a great point too. Yeah, it's like we experience a lot of pressure, external pressure, to give up on faith, to give up on spirituality, to give up on religion. And I think you hit the nail on the head that that mindset is not really necessary, that we can choose to, not be antagonistic, not be angry at the people who are putting that pressure on us, but to love those people where they are, and recognize that's not what I want for my life. Maybe maybe that's what you want for your life, but it's not what I want for my life. So I'm going to keep moving this direction, and and I just love you where you are. And I honestly think that if everybody did that, then I think we'd live in a better world, to be perfectly honest with you. Now Kyle does he does bring up another point here. Um, he has a little bit of an inappropriate thing here, so I'm not sure I can actually put this up on YouTube because I think we'll get censored. But it maybe sounds like maybe somebody in his school experienced um, some a sexual predator, and that situation wasn't dealt with in a manner that was righteous. So um, what I'll say to that end is, um, I am really sorry that that happened, and obviously I can't make that go away, or I would. And I think that the very, very horrible people who do things like that should be held accountable. And it's a shame that, in your experience, the person was not held accountable. But one thing that is really, um, I guess I'll say two things about that. One of them is that part of Christianity is the teaching of a day of judgment. And in the day of judgment, all of those who have victimized others will will experience the will experience God's retribution. So even though justice was not done here on earth, I believe that justice will be done by God in a way that is perfect. And what we see here on earth is very temporary. So that's one thing that I'll say. And the other thing that I'll say is we should never allow someone else's sin or someone else's bad behavior to keep us from doing what we know to be right. So, I would never allow, you know, I mean, in some sense, it kind of reminds me of a story that I remember reading about, um, actually about the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. I probably just butchered that name, but but one time he was meditating, and a young man came up to him, and he was a really buff guy, and he came up to the Buddha, and the Buddha was very fat by this point in his life, and the guy said, "You look like a pig." And the Buddha replied to him and said, "Well, you look like a god." And the man was like, "Why would you say that when I just insulted you?" And the Buddha said, "I think about God all day, so I see God everywhere. Clearly, you think about other things." And so, I bring that up simply to say that when someone else chooses a path that is evil, we can choose to, as frightening as this is, we can choose to allow a seed of bitterness to be within us. But when we become bitter and hateful and allow that person's bad decisions to derail our life, then in some sense that person wins. In some sense, that predator who did unspeakable things to your friend, they have won if you allow them to take up space in your heart. They've won. But if you give that to God and come to God and lay those things aside and trust in God and choose to form a relationship with God irrespective of the bad things that somebody did, and choose not to allow that person's evil deeds to define you, then now that person has been defeated. That person no longer gets to define who you are, because who you are is the person who can say, I think about God and I see God, and you think about other things. So I hope that that helps. And then he does have one more question here, and I'll go ahead and do that. But how are they considered men of God if this is even a possibility? Well, somebody who does something, the short answer is somebody who does something like that isn't a man of God. Um, you know, they're a slave to their passions, they're a slave to their own sins, and in truth, I feel sorry for that person, because what kind of horrible person would do that to a child? I don't even know. So I feel sorry for them. Um, but one thing they are not is a man of God. So that
At least in that act, right? There's wolf
right.
sheep's clothing, and sadly, and there's abuse everywhere. It's rampant, right?
Hmm.
And I don't mean of the predatorial type. I mean of any kind of abuse,
Right.
right? And I think it's really important to recognize that. And it is so sad to hear priests doing that. I mean, it was around even back in the 80s when I was a kid. And
Right.
but there's wolves and sheep clothing everywhere. And like I agree with you, Kevin. You just at at some point we have to demonstrate our godliness ourselves and just turn away,
Mhm.
just like Mary did. Just turn away from it. Don't pay any attention, and it'll take care of itself. Evil has a really weird way of taking care of itself.
Right. That is very true. That is very true. Um, my wife and I kind of joke about that. That it's like Hitler and Stalin were both super evil, and they kind of ended up wiping out each other in in a weird sort of way. So it's kind of like you said, it's like evil just has. I think it's true what Jesus says, that the kingdom of Satan is divided, and if it is divided, how can that kingdom stand? It's sure to fall, because everybody pursuing their own wicked designs, it just can't. It's not sustainable. So that's kind of, we're getting on the cusp of maybe our time for this particular evening, but I'm really excited to see where the um, I'm really excited to see where this goes with the Cyril of Alexandria. I'm excited to see how we how we explore these interesting topics, and I'm really excited to get into that spirituality of God having taken on our human nature so that he can elevate us to partake of his nature. So, Byron, do you have any kind of closing questions, comments, concerns, anything you'd like to bring up, especially about Cyril and what we're going to be going over?
Yeah, kind of like what we talked about a little bit at the very beginning before we started the actual live session is do you do you fully understand the format? Because the book version I have doesn't have the introduction.
Oh,
So the AB format that it has, can you deconstruct that for us, or are we
yeah.
advising this?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, no problem. Absolutely. So, basically, what Cyril is doing. So, I apologize that your one didn't come with the introduction. Um, I keep referencing this, and then you don't have it. So,
Steal yours
oops.
for a second.
Um, but basically, the reason why he does this format is sort of, I'll see if I can find kind of a good example just in case anybody at home hasn't read it. So the way the book starts is person A says, people of true and good sense who have intellectually gathered that knowledge which gives life are never jaded by the sacred sciences. Indeed, it is written that man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes out of the mouth of God. The word of God is food for the mind and a spiritual bread that strengthens the heart of man, as the book of Psalms sings. And then person B says, how right you are. So what Cyril is doing here is, that one is maybe not a great example, because the point of doing it this way is so that basically person A is the teacher or the instructor, and person B is there to sort of be a counterbalance that asks questions, um, and ideally even brings some challenges. So what you'll find as the book goes on is that person B becomes a sort of conglomeration of all of Cyril's students. Cyril being a teacher, person B becomes kind of this conglomeration of, it's not necessarily based on any one person, but more like a pool of people that Cyril has engaged with and taught. So, person B will sometimes be saying things like, that makes perfect sense, and you're absolutely right. And then sometimes he'll say something like, but um the your opponent, and when he says your opponent or the adversary or your adversary, he's usually talking about Nestorius, and he doesn't Cyril doesn't want to say Nestorius because in some sense he's in some sense he's being really obvious, but he's also being in some ways respectful, but maybe also a little bit coy, in that, the followers of Nestorius, if you say, Nestorius is an idiot, you shouldn't listen to him, well, then people who have been listening to Nestorius might be like, he seems fine to me. But if you kind of say it like, well, your opponent might say this, you're right, but he would be wrong because, then it sort of presents it in this very non-confrontational way, so that Cyril is basically, what he's doing is he's kind of having a Socratic dialogue with himself and anticipating what we as the reader will likely be thinking, either what we'll be thinking in support of what he's saying, like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Cyril, or he's anticipating that we might not be fully convinced by his first argument and we might need him to come at it from a different angle. And he's kind of anticipating that and trying to engage with us in a way that's mm, respectful, and in a way that takes into account that we might be coming from different places, and that's okay. He wants to be able to actually engage with us where we are, and do so in a way that's very Socratic in that sense, not in a way, obviously he could just choose to write it out like, this is point this is point one, this is point two, this is where they follow. But by doing it in this conversational way, he enables himself to be a little bit more non confrontational, and he enables himself to be a little bit more philosophical, where he can take these points and, in some sense, have a conversation about it. Kind of like what you and I are doing, where it's like, I'm not just sitting here telling you a bunch of things. We're having a conversation and a dialogue. so that, you can tell me, like, that makes no sense to me, Kevin. Like, that you've got to explain that differently. You're not explaining that very well. Or or you can say, like, I've got that. That is, I get that. Or you can just flat out say, like, I don't agree. I think you're missing this point over here. And we can have that conversation because there's two of us. And this kind of gets at when I said earlier that Socrates was actually against writing. The argument Socrates makes against writing is that he feels that what you lose in writing is the context of relationship where two people are able to engage. And Plato, who was not servant, Socrates' student, basically Plato writes everything because Plato has come to the conclusion, at least in his own mind, that if he preserves the discussion and the conversation, then that's at least almost as good as if you were there for the conversation. It's maybe not as good, but at least then people like you and I, 2,000 years later, can still have some level of learning from Socrates. And whereas Socrates, because he didn't write anything down, if it weren't for Plato, like, people thousands of years later couldn't engage with it. So it is a double edged sword because, like, we have Cyril, so we can engage with it, but at the same time we can't, it's not the same as if we could actually sit down with him and have a conversation. That would be really cool. We can't really do that now in our context. So Cyril is trying to counterbalance that and say, and do it this way so that he's preserving some of the conversational element. And I think I just explained that probably more than I needed to, but I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it did. Thank you.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, um if we don't have any other questions, I think we can probably close up for the night. Looks like Kyle did come back and say, I don't want to dissuade you your beliefs. I enjoy hearing the discourse. I am not right. You're not right. A conversation just needs to happen. Well,
Yeah.
Kyle, I appreciate you saying that. And yeah, I don't think you're gonna dissuade me. I don't think you're gonna dissuade Byron. Um, we're we're big boys. We're grown ups. We
Hmm.
can deal with a little bit. And I'm glad you showed up and participated in the discussion. That I think it's helpful to be able to actually discuss things and
Hmm.
not just bottle them up. So
Yeah, I love that.
thank Awesome. So thank you for participating. Thank you people who participated live, and thank you Byron for actually being here. And we'll see you next week for our second thing with the Cyril of Alexandria.
I guess I do have one final question before we.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Is there a particular point in the book that we should all be at by our next meeting, or does it matter?
Um, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
It certainly doesn't matter for next week. After next week, what I'm going to be talking about mostly is going to be in the book that we sell at the store. Um, it has a little introduction, and we're going to talk about that little introduction um for the first one. So I wouldn't worry about it too much since you don't have the introduction anyway. So feel free to just kind of read ahead. And then afterwards it'll be a little bit more guided to where I'll have some more, like, a section just to, but even then, if you've read ahead, that's totally fine. I don't think it'll matter too much. Yeah, I don't think it's a pretty short book. I don't think we're gonna have too much of a problem of like getting lost or anything. And if you have a question that's if something comes up where you're like, I really want to ask this, but it's maybe not where we are in the thing, feel free to ask. And if it's too far ahead, then I'll probably just say, oh, we'll discuss that more next week. But yeah, for the most part, I think it's it's not going to matter too much.
Awesome.
All
Cool.
right.
I'm
Well,
excited.
I am too, and I'll see you next week. And next week I am planning to do it in person as well.
Awesome.
So feel free to join in person, or if it's more convenient for you to do it online, just let me know and we can make sure that it's available that way too.
Great.
All right. Well, God bless everybody. Have a great night, and Saint Cyril, pray for us.
All right. Thanks, Kevin.